There are moments in sports that start as one thing and become something else entirely before anyone realizes what's happening. A single play, a few seconds of contact, and suddenly a basketball game becomes a national argument about race, loyalty, coaching, and accountability that nobody saw coming when the opening tip went up. That's exactly what happened to Stephanie White, and by the time it was over, the Indiana Fever's head coach had been called out by a sitting politician, threatened by a state attorney general, booed inside her own arena, and publicly dismantled on national television by one of the loudest voices in sports media. All of it, every single piece of it, traced back to one foul on one August night in Chicago that lasted less than 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds were about to change everything. August 8th, the Indiana Fever traveled to Chicago for a road matchup against the Sky, and the tension outside the United Center that evening had nothing to do with basketball. Protesters had gathered outside the arena hours before tip-off, their presence directly tied to comments Sophie Cunningham had made publicly in the days leading up to the game. The atmosphere was already charged before a single shot had been attempted. Inside the building, though, the game itself started to take over. Caitlin Clark was doing what she does, knocking down shots from range, running the offense, commanding attention the way she always does when the Fever are clicking. Indiana had brought a loud, passionate, traveling fan base into an opposing building, and early on, it felt like a routine road win was in the making. Then, Dejonai Carrington checked in. Coming off a foot injury that had delayed her entire season, Carrington didn't ease her way back onto the floor. She went straight to work, scoring 8 points in roughly 4 minutes, playing with the kind of intensity that immediately reminded everyone watching exactly why her career had been worth tracking in the first place. She looked healthy, she looked sharp, she looked like someone with a point to prove. And then the game changed in a way that nobody standing inside that building was going to forget anytime soon. Cunningham broke free on a fast break, clear path, nothing but open floor between her and the basket. Carrington gave chase from behind, closing the gap at full sprint, and as Cunningham elevated for the layup, Carrington's arms swept hard across her face and neck. Cunningham hit the floor. The ball somehow still rattled home, and the officials blew the whistle on a play that was about to get a lot more complicated than a standard foul call. The initial ruling was a regular foul, routine, the kind of call that gets made 50 times a game across the league and disappears from memory before the next possession is even run. But then came the review. Officials pulled up the replay, watched it again, watched it a second time, and upgraded the contact to a flagrant 2. The announcement crackled across the arena loudspeaker, the crowd erupted, and Carrington was ejected. But the ejection wasn't the moment everyone would be replaying online for the next week. That moment came immediately afterward, when Cunningham got back to her feet, walked directly toward Carrington, and shoved her before teammates and arena security could step between them. Officials reviewed that too, ultimately deciding that Cunningham's reaction was proportional to what she had just experienced and issuing no technical foul against her. Chicago's head coach Tyler Marsh, to his credit, offered a surprisingly measured response in the aftermath, saying he believed, in real time, that Carrington was simply trying to make a play on the ball. He also admitted, almost as an aside, that he hadn't gone back and carefully studied the replay before commenting publicly. That admission seemed minor in the moment. It would become more interesting later, because this story wasn't going to stay a story about a basketball play for very long. Indiana held on for the win, 90-86, but the moment Carrington walked toward that locker room, the conversation stopped being about the final score entirely. And what she did next made absolutely sure of it.
She didn't wake. Carrington barely had time to reach the locker room before she was already posting 2 words, no explanation, tagged directly at the Indiana Fever's official account: white privilege. The post spread instantly, the way anything connected to Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever tends to spread these days, which is to say it moved across every platform simultaneously and at a speed that gave nobody involved a chance to get ahead of it. Then, almost immediately afterward, she posted something else. The date of the next scheduled meeting between the Fever and the Sky, circled for the entire world to see. No caption needed, the message was already clear enough. This wasn't finished, not even close. The backlash came hard and fast from multiple directions at once. Days later, Carrington tried to clarify what she had meant, explaining that she hadn't intended to suggest the flagrant 2 call itself was driven by race, that her frustration had been real, but her phrasing had been imprecise. She also acknowledged something that felt almost like a warning about herself, admitting that her aggressive defensive style could lead to moments like this again, regardless of intent, that playing the way she plays carries a certain kind of risk built right into it. Cunningham wasn't in a clarifying mood. She called the foul intentional. She called out Carrington publicly for what she described as pulling the race card after a bad play went against her. She referenced Angel Reese by name, suggesting Carrington had learned a playbook from somewhere and was following it on cue. It was pointed, it was direct, and it was the kind of comment that guaranteed the story was going to keep burning for at least another news cycle. But Cunningham also made something clear that gets overlooked when people replay the sharper parts of what she said. She stated flatly that there was no personal history between them, no previous conflict, no grudge sitting underneath the surface waiting for a moment like that to bubble up. And she said with equal clarity that she did not believe the incident was actually about race. Her position was simple. If someone puts their hands on her during a game, she is going to respond. What her response looked like, she suggested, said everything about what had just been done to her and nothing about who she is as a person or a player. Indiana had won the game. The scoreboard said 90-86 in the Fever's favor. Under almost any other circumstances, that would have been the story. But the final score had been completely buried by the time the post-game presser started, because the question everyone wanted answered had nothing to do with points or assists or rebounding margins. It had everything to do with what Stephanie White had said, how she had said it, and what that moment was going to cost her. Standing in front of reporters minutes after the buzzer, White went to the podium and delivered a response that nobody inside the Fever organization could have fully anticipated would trigger the avalanche that followed. She called it a hard foul. She said she did not believe Carrington had intentionally targeted Cunningham's neck. And then she went further than that, praising Carrington's competitive nature in a way that, depending on which way you were already leaning, could read as either generous context or staggering tone deafness. She talked about how nobody simply walks in for an easy layup against Carrington, that she is always going to compete at full intensity, play her heart out every single time down the floor, and that this particular sequence was simply an expression of who she has always been as a player. White agreed with the ejection. She just didn't sound especially troubled by the broader situation. That tone was the problem, not any individual sentence she chose, not the specific words she used to describe the contact or the officiating decision. It was the overall register of her response, the absence of alarm, the almost admiring quality of how she talked about Carrington's competitiveness in a moment that had just sent one of her own players crashing to the floor. Cunningham's face and neck had taken the brunt of that contact, and White was at the podium, effectively explaining what a fierce competitor the player who had caused it was. Camera footage circulating online made things considerably worse. Replays showed White standing on the sideline in a direct sightline to the play as it unfolded, eyes forward, appearing to watch the sequence happen in real time. That footage collided directly with the tone of her response and created a contradiction that critics were going to pick apart for days. The backlash that followed didn't build slowly. It gathered force the way things gather force in today's media environment, which is instantly and without any natural ceiling on how far it can travel before something stops it. And this particular story had no shortage of people willing to keep pushing it further.
By Sunday morning, the controversy had already traveled far beyond sports.
Indiana's Lieutenant Governor, Micah Beckwith, posted publicly that the Fever needed to let Stephanie White go. His words were unambiguous. He called her handling of the situation terrible coaching and argued that no real coach ever takes the side of an opposing player who just committed a flagrant foul on one of her own. It was a post designed to land with impact, and it did. But it also left out something worth noting. White hadn't just coached Carrington briefly or in a minor capacity. She had coached her for 2 full seasons at the Connecticut Sun, directly during the stretch in which Carrington earned Most Improved Player honors. That history doesn't excuse the way White's comments landed with an already frustrated and suspicious fan base. It does explain why her read of the play carried a different weight than a stranger's would have. Why she reached instinctively for context that someone who had never seen Carrington play under her guidance wouldn't think to apply. Whether that context excused anything is a separate debate. But leaving it out of the conversation entirely, the way Beckwith's post did, made the situation sound considerably more damning than the full picture supported. Then, Florida's Attorney General, James Umair, stepped into the middle of it from several states away. His post claimed that the WNBA knew better than to play games in his state because he would personally be charging players with assault. The specific language got revised a day later. He clarified it to assault and battery after the original post drew significant national attention and backlash of its own. What got buried under the noise of that revision was a fairly basic fact. The WNBA has never had a franchise based in Florida. Umair had no actual jurisdiction over anything connected to this incident, and his threat was symbolic from the moment he posted it. It was a signal, not a legal warning, a way of announcing which side of a cultural argument he was standing on, without any real enforcement mechanism attached to it. No criminal charges were ever filed against Carrington related to the play. Umair kept going. He used the moment to weigh in on the league's ongoing eligibility debates, publicly mocking the WNBA's own description of those issues as complex and nuanced, and framing the entire episode as part of a broader cultural fight rather than a dispute about one specific foul during one specific basketball game. None of this surprised anyone who follows how sports intersect with politics at the national level. What was striking was how quickly it all happened. A basketball play on a Friday night had become a multi-state political flashpoint by Sunday morning, and the people at the center of it, Carrington, Cunningham, and White, were still processing the weekend when elected officials were already using their names to make points about things that had nothing to do with the flagrant 2. Here's where the story gets more complicated than a single bad press conference. Because this wasn't actually the first time this season that Stephanie White had publicly defended a player who physically hurt one of her own stars. The first time happened back in June, and it involved a different player and a different kind of contact, but the same essential structure underneath it. Phoenix Mercury forward Alyssa Thomas caught Caitlin Clark with a fist to the throat during a game earlier in the season. What was initially missed by officials entirely was upgraded after the league reviewed the play, resulting in a flagrant 2 call and a 1-game suspension for Thomas. Thomas said it was a complete accident and found out about the suspension only minutes before the league made the announcement public, leaving her almost no time to process it before she was standing before reporters trying to explain herself. White, who had also coached Thomas for 2 seasons at Connecticut, defended her. She argued that officials deserved more blame for missing the play live than Thomas did for the contact itself. She spoke forcefully against the wave of racial abuse and death threats Thomas received online in the days that followed, insisting the league's players deserved protection for competing hard rather than punishment. That part of her response was unambiguously correct. What it did, though, was establish a pattern that nobody could ignore once the Carrington incident landed on top of it. 2 incidents, 2 players who had previously played under White at Connecticut, 2 public defenses from the same coach. That is not proof of anything. It is not a confirmed fact that White applies a different standard for former players than she does to opponents she has no relationship with. But it is a genuine question and a fair one to ask out loud rather than quietly dismiss.
Does coaching someone for 2 years, watching them grow, helping them earn an award, create a kind of blind spot that shows up in moments of crisis? Does loyalty built over a season or two of daily work together create an instinct toward context and explanation that simply doesn't get extended to strangers? Nobody outside the Fever's inner circle can answer that with certainty. What is certain is that the pattern exists, and once critics noticed it, it gave the backlash a shape that was harder to argue against than any individual comment White had made at the podium.
By Tuesday, ahead of the home game against the New York Liberty, Stephanie White had clearly decided she was done letting everyone else control the story. The Beckwith post alone might have faded within a day or two the way most political sports commentary eventually does once the news cycle finds something newer to devour. But it hadn't faded. It had merged with the growing online backlash, attached itself to the camera footage, and given the frustration circulating among fans an official-sounding voice that amplified everything. Once an elected official publicly calls for a coach to lose her job, the story stops being a sports debate. It becomes something closer to a referendum. And referendums don't resolve themselves quietly. They demand a public response from the person sitting at the center of them. White came to the podium that Tuesday and delivered a prepared statement. She took 0 follow-up questions, none. She controlled the entire exchange from the moment she opened her mouth to the moment she walked away. And what she said in between covered an enormous amount of ground in a very short amount of time. She opened by insisting that player safety and wellness are always her top priority, that the relationships she builds with players are something she takes genuine pride in, that those bonds are built over years rather than months, and that nothing about that was going to change regardless of external noise. Then came the explanation that would dominate headlines for the next 48 hours. She said she had not seen the play in real time, that she had gone straight from the sideline into a press conference without a single moment to review any footage, that in that moment, walking into that room cold, she believed the officials had gotten the call right based on whatever limited information she was working from. And then she said something that surprised even some of her defenders. Watching the replay afterward over and over again, she admitted clearly and without qualification that it was egregious. She simply hadn't had access to that footage when she spoke to reporters the night of the game, and she wanted that distinction understood before anyone drew any further conclusions about what her original comments had meant. That explanation landed differently for different people. Some found it completely credible. Head coaches operate in a fog during live games, managing rotations and defensive schemes and matchup adjustments all at once, and the idea that she missed or misread a specific play in real time isn't inherently implausible. Others thought it raised more questions than it answered, pointing to the camera footage showing her in a direct sight line to the contact as it happened. Neither side moved the other at all. Then the tone of the statement shifted dramatically. She began talking about hate, about fear-mongering, about divisiveness trying to hijack the league from the outside. She said none of it would win. She declared the Fever united, connected, and completely unbothered by whatever noise was circulating beyond the arena walls. And then, without pausing or softening anything, she told her critics to go to hell. Not in those exact words, but close enough that nobody in the room or watching the clip afterward was left wondering what she meant or who she was talking to. The sequence, a call for love, grace, and humility, followed immediately by a dismissal containing none of those things, was jarring to hear in real time, and even more jarring to watch on replay. Critics who had been waiting for a reason to push harder suddenly had exactly what they needed. And the loudest one of all was already sitting behind a desk with a microphone and a national audience. Stephen A. Smith didn't tiptoe into this one. He went straight for the contradiction that everyone watching had already noticed, and he turned the volume up to a level that made it impossible for anyone still paying attention to look away. The leap from love, grace, and humility directly into telling people to go to hell, he asked in his signature manner, whether White genuinely believed that combination was going to play well with anyone who was already skeptical, whether it was designed to calm the situation or whether it was the kind of statement that could only make it worse. But his deeper argument wasn't really about the statement itself, it was about the claim that preceded it. His core challenge was this: how does a head coach, actively managing her team on the sideline of a professional basketball game, miss the single most consequential play of her entire season? Not a play happening on the opposite end of the floor in traffic, not a scramble play buried in a pile of bodies near the basket, a fast break, open floor, a clear sequence with a beginning, a middle, and a violent ending that sent one of her players to the ground. Smith's contention was that watching the game isn't a secondary task for a head coach. It is the job, possession by possession, up and down the floor, every single time the ball moves. And the idea that she simply missed this particular sequence while actively coaching that game was something he was not willing to accept at face value. He then added the detail that cut sharpest and landed with the most force. This wasn't happening on the road. Coaches learn to expect hostility in visiting buildings. The crowd noise, the boos during timeouts, the unfriendly energy. It's part of the away experience every coach in every professional league accounts for and eventually tunes out. What was happening to White was happening inside her own arena. During pre-game introductions, her own fans, sitting in seats they had paid for, booing her before the ball had even been tipped for a game that actually mattered in the standings. Smith called that what it was, not ordinary criticism, not the kind of background noise that comes bundled with coaching at the professional level, a warning signal flashing directly from the people who are supposed to trust her the most. Fox News personality Tommy Lahren offered a different angle on the same basic criticism, describing White's pre-game statement as performative rather than protective. Her argument was that the emotional intensity behind White's podium moment looked less like genuine concern for what had happened to Cunningham on the floor, and more like frustration at being questioned and criticized in public. That White was upset about the scrutiny more than she was upset about the foul. Whether that reading is fair is genuinely debatable. Reasonable people who watch the exact same clip have landed in completely different places depending on what they brought into the viewing. What is harder to dismiss is the underlying theory that had taken hold among critics by that point, that White's two-season coaching relationship with Carrington had quietly shaped how she initially processed the play, perhaps without her even being fully aware of it. Her defenders pushed back against that idea firmly, arguing she was simply describing what she believed she saw at full game speed, not protecting a former player out of misplaced loyalty. The unanswerable question sitting underneath all of it, the one that nobody inside or outside the Fever organization could fully resolve, was whether she would stand at that podium and deliver the same response if the player who had just swept an arm across Cunningham's face and neck was someone she had never coached a single day in her career. Nobody can answer that. It may never be settled. But the fact that people kept asking it was already doing damage on its own. Smith's broader point, stripped of the theatrics that made his version of it go viral, was really about standards, about what leadership under a national microscope actually costs. Coaching Caitlin Clark's Indiana Fever was never going to be a low-visibility job, where a coaching decision could pass without being examined from 17 different angles before the final buzzer even sounds. Every word, every facial expression, every offhand comment at a post-game podium was always going to be treated as content the moment it left her mouth. That is the reality of being in charge of the most watched team in the league right now. It doesn't feel fair, and it probably isn't, but feeling unfair and being avoidable are two completely different things, and White had been in this job long enough to know exactly what kind of attention surrounded it. While cable television spent the better part of a week dissecting intent and motive and coaching philosophy, the people who actually shared a locker room with Stephanie White were preparing to answer a very different question, and they were going to answer it the way athletes always answer the questions that matter most, not with words, with performance. Cunningham spoke to reporters with a directness that left no room for interpretation. The locker room was good, she said, tight. The coach loved her players, and her players knew it.
She repeated the explanation for White's initial comments. She hadn't seen the replay, she went straight to a press conference, end of story, and made it plain that nothing about the sequence felt like a betrayal from where she was standing on the inside. That was the entire explanation the locker room needed, nothing more complicated than that.
Clark went further. She admitted that the booing during pre-game introductions had made her feel physically sick, that she had walked into the arena that night and told White directly, before the ball ever moved, that the team was going to win the game for her. And she pushed back publicly on the fans who had turned on their own coach inside their own arena on a night when the energy should have been pointed outward rather than inward at someone on their own side. The frustration in Clark's voice when she talked about it wasn't performance, it was real. The game itself carried its own chaos before it settled into anything resembling rhythm. Clark picked up a technical foul for accidentally bumping an official, her 8th of the season, a call that would have triggered an automatic one-game suspension and cost her the very next matchup if it had stood. The league reviewed the play afterward and rescinded the technical entirely before it could cost her anything. White picked up a technical of her own, arguing a call from the sideline. Everyone's nerves were raw and visible, and impossible to hide under that kind of pressure and scrutiny. None of it slowed Indiana down by a single beat. The Fever ran past the New York Liberty 106-92 in a performance that felt almost deliberately emphatic given the week that had preceded it. Clark finished with 22 points and 10 assists, her 19th career game with at least 20 points and 10 assists, more such games than any other player in franchise history has produced across an entire career combined. Kelsey Mitchell added 28 points, 20 of them in the first half alone, extending her streak of scoring 20 or more points to 17 consecutive games, a run that has quietly established itself as one of the best individual stretches in the entire league this season, and one of the best of her career by any measure. While pundits spent the week debating whether Stephanie White deserved to lose her job, her players were delivering one of the most dominant performances of the entire season, almost as if the scoreboard itself had something to say about all of it. Locker room loyalty is real. It exists inside this roster in a way that clearly hasn't fractured, despite everything the outside noise has suggested about a team on the verge of collapse. A dominant win doesn't settle every unresolved question, and it won't silence the criticism permanently if the results start moving in the wrong direction as the playoff race tightens. Winning quiets almost anything in professional sports for as long as it keeps happening. Losing has the opposite effect, and it tends to drag every unresolved controversy back into the light with considerably more force than it carried the first time around. What started as 3 seconds of contact during a road game in Chicago had become, within the span of a single week, a controversy touching race, coaching loyalty, political opportunism, fan trust, media accountability, and the unique pressure that comes with running the most watched team in women's basketball right now. Every piece of it traceable back to one arm sweeping across one player's face during one fast break that most people inside the United Center that night had already stopped paying close attention to by the time it happened. Stephanie White survived the immediate storm. Her players backed her when it would have been easier to go quiet. The scoreboard backed her when it mattered. The locker room held when plenty of people on the outside were predicting it wouldn't. But surviving a storm and being ready for the next one are two entirely different things, and the next one already has a date attached to it. Carrington circled it herself, posted it publicly, made sure the entire sports world had it marked on their calendars before the noise from the first incident had even started to fade. The next time Indiana and Chicago share a floor, every camera in that building is going to be pointed at Stephanie White just as closely as it's pointed at the game itself. Every decision she makes in real time, every reaction on her face, every word she chooses at the podium afterward is going to be measured against everything that came before it. The scrutiny that felt overwhelming this week is going to feel mild by comparison.
The question hanging over the Indiana Fever right now isn't whether Stephanie White is a good coach. Her players believe in her. Her locker room has told the world exactly where it stands. The question is whether she's ready to exist at this specific level of visibility, under this specific kind of pressure, making real-time decisions that are going to be analyzed frame by frame before she's even finished making them. One foul, one post, one press conference that went sideways, one statement that ended in the wrong register, and suddenly a season that had been building towards something real was temporarily swallowed by a story about everything except basketball. The wins are what matter now, and so far, Indiana keeps producing them. But Carrington's circled date is coming, and when it arrives, everybody in and around this league is going to find out exactly what kind of coach Stephanie White is when the whole world is already watching and waiting to be proven right.